with state India and banking in India. There are not too many armies that have more than 200,000 soldiers and 20,000 units. So you can understand the enormity of responsibility he has and what it takes to be able to come away to Singapore for that. Mr. S.S. Chandra, delighted to have you also over here. Reserve Bank of India, as you know, is more than just a central bank in India. Besides keeping an eye on inflation, it manages one of the most diverse, extensive banking sector in the world in an environment where banking is exploding across the country in a completely new technological environment. And for all that sometimes we hear about RBI's challenges, they're doing a magnificent job in India. And delighted also to have Mr. Vaidyanathan. Congratulations on taking on enormous responsibility at IDFC. Mrs. Kamal Pandya. We look forward every week to the publication of Dint Asia, and it is really a very, very useful addition to not just the financial landscape of Singapore, but anyone who's interested in both Southeast Asia and India is always enriched by its weekly publication. Now, before such an illustrious panel of speakers, to put a diplomat in the firing line on a subject as technical as banking, maybe an investment in an NPA, I suspect. But I'll try and set out a broad framework, because I wouldn't dare to venture into or tread into some very specific areas of banking. But it couldn't have been a more timely event and a more appropriate subject, not just because of the fact that we have begun the recapitalization process, which was talked about for a number of years, but also because we're all being absolutely distorted, transfixed by certain diamond merchants in the world. And that has put an unwarranted sometimes, and I think an exaggerated spotlight on what people perceive to be a systemic malaise in our banking system. This was not the first one in the world, not the most unprecedented one. And every time a crisis like this happens, you want to completely revamp the banking system without realizing that sometimes greater challenges have befallen banking sector in the United States. Then we shouldn't be so short as to not forget 2008 and to UK and other countries. So sometimes it is important to put things in a perspective. And it is also important, before we get on to speak a little bit about what's happening, to put the Indian banking sector in a perspective. And that we are talking about a banking sector which has 27 public sector banks, 21 private sector banks. It has 56 regional rural banks. It has 1,600 urban cooperative banks, and it has 93,000 rural cooperative banks. I mean, that is the extent of the banking sector we are talking about. Of course, 70% of it is in the public sector, 25% in the private, and 5% for the foreign banks. But what is important is that banks in India are not just banks that do transaction and finance. They have been a wonderful instrument of development in India and have been a great instrument of pursuit of some of the most challenging economic policies in the country, whether it is the development of our agricultural sector, employment generation, medium and small scale industries, or reaching banking to the unbanked in the remotest parts of the countries and the poorest of the rural areas where no bank dare to tread, at times when we didn't have phones in. So we have to put it in that perspective. And what is happening today, we see are three trends in India. One, that we are witnessing a very promising macroeconomic environment of high rates of growth with great macroeconomic stability, which is showing further signs of improvement. But at the same time, we see a challenge in the banking sector, which is a legacy issue. And third, we see a complete digital revolution, which in its first instance is revolutionizing the banking sector in the country. So we have a situation where the economy is growing at about 7.5% on an average, and when it drops to 6.7%, There is a great deal of frenzy and anxiety across the world, but that speaks to the promise and expectations of the Indian economy that nothing less than 7.5% is considered good enough. And all that is taking place in an environment where the fiscal deficit is coming down, inflation rate is coming down, current account deficit is sustainable, exchange rate is stable, and our foreign exchange reserves have never been higher. It's about $420 billion now. But the current crisis has its really roots in starting in 2003, as all of you would know, when there was an absolute explosion of bank credit that was growing at an extraordinary rate, inevitable in boom periods when we were growing at 8 to 9%. And then when the 2008 crisis hit, there was a combination of fiscal stimulus and credit-driven effort at sustaining growth, which led to, of course, increase in fiscal deficit. It led to increase in inflation rate, but also to the bank credit now climbing to about 50% of our GDP by 2012. But if you see the period 2008-2012, that is the period when the banking sector saw an explosion of it. At a time when the economy was beginning to slow down, there's nothing worse than an over-leveraged economy. There was excess capacity in the economy. There were a lot of investments in the infrastructure sector. There were questionable decisions also by private sector investors. There were questions about appraisals. And there was certainly, if you recall, a lot of controversy about decisions taken by the government, particularly when it concerned resource allocation by the government itself. There were complications in infrastructure sector because of the regulations of transitioning from what was a public monopoly to a private sector competitive environment. And there was, of course, implementation issues. But the net result is that when the government came in, there was already the NPAs were climbing to 10-12%, and that it was $150 billion, $160 billion, take your calculations. The provisioning was about 25 to 28%. That left a gap of about 110 billion to be filled in, which is where the crisis really started. But when the government came into office 3 years ago, a lot of people said nothing is happening. But I can tell you, as having been inside that in the government and in the office of the Prime Minister, that right from day one, this was one of the priority areas of concern for the government. But what the Prime Minister wanted to be sure about, and what the government was keen on, was not to reward profligacy and excesses of the past, and not to continue sending signals that you can borrow and forget. There was also, of course, the desire that it should be the process should be transparent and objective, and that it should not put an unnecessary burden on the taxpayers or on the government's balance sheet. Now, this is a very, very difficult set of objectives to fulfill, especially when the banks are so stressed. And it was a twin balance sheet stress, because the concomitant thing was that the private sector was facing a concomitant problem of stressed balance sheets, and in private investments were anemic. We were fortunate that we had the fiscal space for public sector, public investments, and there was a lot of consumption-driven push for growth. But then there has been a series of really, really important steps that have been taken. Number one, of course, is in the monetary policy management, and I think though it doesn't relate directly to banking, but the fact is that we have now a framework under which there is a monetary policy committee that takes decisions. There has been demonetization and the GST, which has in a sense enhanced the formalization of the economy. But in the banking sector, you have benefited immensely from the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, the Banking Regulation Amendment Act, the complete awareness and acceptance of the need to recognize when an asset is turning bad, not pushing it away somewhere or brushing it under the carpet. And a process of recognition, resolution, recapitalization and recovery is truly underway. And last October, government announced a $33 billion recapitalization plan made up of 21 billion in recapitalization bonds, $3 billion in direct injection of budgetary support, and $9 billion to be raised from the markets. That was to be a 2-year process. In the last fiscal we just ended, which is just ending, or we have issued recapitalization bonds of about $14 billion, injection of budgetary support of $1.3 billion, and market has helped raise about $3 billion. So this recapitalization is well on the way. There has been, after 2 years of very, very slow and sometimes negative growth in credit in the first time, as some people said, in 60 years, there has been a credit recovery in the non-food sector in a fairly significant manner. And there are what we call the green shoots that are coming up. But what is happened is that as a result of this PNB problem, there has been obviously there is going to be some sort of a slowdown as banks look at their balance sheets again, look at their accounts. There is going to be definitely an increase in the interest rate and greater scrutiny on the letters of undertaking, and that is going to be there for some time. But I'm confident that this is a transitory phase, notwithstanding the headlines that you see in the television, because the banks are pretty clear about what they are dealing with. And the problem is fairly specific, and it can be narrowed down to a very, very small level of challenge. And I think all banks are taking a close look at what is going on. But broadly speaking, we are on the right path, and we are doing this, remember, in a manner that is not going to put a burden on the taxpayers, nor is it going to put any burden on the government balance sheet, and will therefore not affect the fiscal deficit on which the government is very, very clear. But then there's this other story that is unfolding. Here is a nation which has 1.1 billion UID on biometrics, a billion bank accounts now covering 99% of the population as a result of 310 million new accounts being opened in the course of the last 3 years under the Jan Dhan Yojana. In these bank accounts, there are nearly 12 billion deposits in these 300 billion new accounts that have opened. There have been $30 billion of direct transfer of benefits under various government schemes to 415 million beneficiaries in the country. There is a complete growth in the digitalization of the banking system. We have today, in the course of 1 year, a 7,000% increase in Aadhaar enabled payment. According to RBI data, in January, total digital transactions were $2 trillion in India, covering 1.1 billion transactions. You today have digital payment banks, you have small banks, and now you have DBS, which has just got a license to operate a wholly owned subsidiary in India. So there is a great deal of change that is taking place in the banking sector. Last year, in January, the Institute for Research and Development in Banking Technology issued a very rigorous report on use of blockchain technology. And it is finding some extraordinary positive results in trade financing and banking. So we are already looking ahead at the future technologies of the blockchain. We have a statutory working group now on fintech, which is the next big revolution taking place. And incidentally, we've also just started a joint working group with Singapore on fintech. And in the course of this year, you will see our payment systems getting integrated, hopefully, as we work through our systems. So there is a lot of positive changes that are taking place in the banking sector. And when we look to the future, see what we are looking at. An economy that is going to grow from $2.4 trillion now dollars to $5 trillion economy in another 8 to 10 years if we continue to grow at 7.5%, which we will, because that's been our trend line. And remember that at 33% investment to GDP ratio, this is an economy that's going to see $1.7 trillion of aggregate investment. That's housing sector. That's right. That's what the government got right there. Here is a growth in the middle class. The entire country is coming into financial inclusion. There is going to be seamless connectivity to the unified payment interface. So there are so many wonderful things that are happening as far as there is the government's new emphasis on de-stressing the medium and small scale sectors. The GST network, whatever else it may have done, is bringing medium and small scale sectors that constitute 99% of enterprises in India into the formal sector, which will also open new opportunities for bank lending to this sector. But in addition to all this, there is this explosion of startups, the rise of enterprise in India. And banking sector reforms will continue. It is not just about the ownership of banks. I mean, far too much emphasis is placed on if you can privatize the banks in India, you're going to solve all the problems. I think this is an absolute fallacy. Because you've seen the greatest of private sector banks go down, disappear overnight on September 25, 2000. It is about management. It is about what the government will do as the shareholder for instituting professionalism and management. And as the recapitalization process is going, it is not free lunch. There is a great emphasis on performance, on accountability, on reforms in the management. And the kind of risk bearing that the public sector banks in India have undertaken is impossible for private sector banks. And it isn't that they're not innovating. State Bank of India is just launched a digital banking system in India, which is going to be a completely new revolutionary banking here. Of course, DBS has also started.
One more chair.
Look at it. There's a great pressure on the banking system. But this is also important to understand that this is taking place in a larger macro reforms in the governance system in India. For the first time in a long time of our history, that we see that the emphasis on governance reforms takes as much priority as economic reforms. And if you see the budget speeches of the last 2 years, almost always begin with the idea of governance reforms. Because the government realizes that however good the policies may be, however good the laws may be, it's ultimately also a question of good governance, which means you must not only do the right thing, but you must do the thing right. And that is the fundamental objective with which the government is proceeding. It is starting at the top, but it will affect and it will influence every sector of governance in India. It is going to be responsive, proactive, transparent, policy-driven, rather than discretionary. And the pace of digitalization, the emphasis on autonomy, the focus on good quality management is a reflection of that. And nothing symbolizes this better than Mr. Rajneesh Kumar taking over as chairman of SBI for a period of 3 years. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we hear the speakers, put the larger picture in perspective of the unprecedented change that is taking place in India. Sometimes not so visible because the extraordinary size and the scale of challenges that we face. But it is important to go and feed the energy, the enterprise, and the innovation that is the principal driver of change in India. And that change is also coming into the banking sector. And we look forward to hearing more from our expert speakers. Thank you very much.